Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Nelson Polsby, who is the Heller Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. He was the director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC from 1988 to 1999 and editor of the American Political Science Review from 1971 to 1977. He's the author and co-author of 14 books, including Community Power and Political Theory, Congress and the Presidency, Political Promises, British Government and Its Discontent, Consequences of Party Reform, Political Innovation in America, The Politics of Policy Initiative, and Presidential Elections, written with Aaron Wildavsky, which is in its 10th edition. His forthcoming book is How Congress Evolves, Social Bases of Institutional Change, which will be published by Oxford University Press. Professor Polsby has a PhD from Yale, and among his honorary degrees are ones from Oxford and the University of Liverpool. Nelson, welcome to our program.
Thanks.
Where were you born and raised?
Norwich, Connecticut, which is the eastern agricultural part of the state, and
you were raised there?
I suppose.
Yes?
Yeah.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
I haven't the slightest idea. That's beyond me. My dad was always interested in public affairs, but that doesn't count as character. That's just intellectual interest.
Yeah. Well, but that's an important question. So is it from him that you get this fascination with politics?
I think probably, yeah. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, which my brothers and I think, inherited.
And humor is a tool that you use a lot, isn't it, in your work?
Well, yeah, it's sort of like a can opener. It gets you to things where you want to be.
Was there a lot of discussion about politics around the dinner table among relatives, or what?
I think some. It's a little hard to say. My dad died when I was 12 years old, mm-hmm. So certainly not as an adult, and. No, I don't remember much about dinner table
conversation. Okay. What about school? Any teachers when you were young, before you went to college, that were influential in getting you interested in the kind of things that later?
No, I was already interested by the time I would say went to high school.
I see.
Was
it from reading newspapers?
Yeah, I read the newspapers.
Yeah.
And listened to the radio. World War II was on when I was a kid.
I see. And so
I listened to CBS News and stuff like that.
So very early you became a news junkie.
Yeah, I'd say so.
And so tell us a little about your education. You went to Johns Hopkins?
The usual stuff.
I see.
BA Johns Hopkins, mm-hmm. which was and is a very interesting little school, mm-hmm. mostly for pre-meds and engineers, but they had a very good small group of social scientists there who were quite accessible to undergraduate students. And then they didn't, however, have a sociology department. And I thought sociology, sort of, as you know, monopolizes all the good subjects. Mm-hmm. So I took a year and studied sociology at Brown, which had a good demography group and some other things. Mm-hmm. And then went to Yale for a PhD.
Mm-hmm. And throughout your work, it's very clear that there's an intellectual curiosity, a capacity to sort of figure out things. Any sources of that other than in your genes, or was it teachers who brought you to that? Or
no, I haven't decided. I've always been pretty much a self-starter, I would say. There have been good teachers along the way, but I wouldn't say that they were the source of my curiosity about things. The source of my curiosity was seeing things going on in the world and wondering how come. Mm-hmm. For a while, when I was away at boarding school, my family moved to Washington. And there was a lot of Washington talk when I would go home for vacations. And a lot of people would make, as they do in Washington, comments about what was causing what and the rest. In particular, I'd have to say one of the main intellectual influences in my life was Joe McCarthy, because Joe McCarthy was running rampant through Washington. People were making all kinds of wild statements about Joe McCarthy, and I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if it's true. And in due course, at Johns Hopkins for an honors thesis, I started digging in to get a feel for why Joe McCarthy was as effective as he seemed to be in scaring the daylights out of people in the Washington community.
And one of the things that you found really was that he and his entourage were getting more credit than they deserved.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd been overrated.
Yeah.
I began to see interesting contrast between what people thought in the Washington community and what could be established by digging around in public opinion materials and electoral materials and things like that. For example, it happened to be the case that Joe McCarthy was always the least popular guy on the ticket in Wisconsin. The least popular winner, I should say. He wasn't anywhere near as powerful at the grassroots as people in Washington made him out to be. Well, that was sort of interesting, and I thought, well, it's possible by application of common sense and finding out about some things that were actually in their beginning stages, focused public opinion work, electoral analysis, things like that, to dope out what was true and what was false about the claims that were being made in the public arena. And that struck me as a lot of fun, and is, I suppose, was one of the reasons why I persisted and went on into graduate school, because I thought the idea that there was actually a profession out there in which people paid you American money to study this stuff. And I thought, well, let's give it a try. I mean, that's been, I suppose.
But while we're on McCarthy, just because there was one other interesting thing here, which is not only was McCarthy given credit for having helped defeat more senators than he had helped defeat, but in the end there was a lot of confusion about why he gained the power that he got. And you were really one of the first ones to point out the reasons there, namely that the Republican Party supported him.
Yeah, sure. And that earned me a certain amount of disdain from some of the people senior to me who had other ideas, but other and less good ideas on the subject, and who were in general people who were quite wonderful social scientists, like Dan Bell and Richard Hofstadter. It sort of irked them that the party explanation just never occurred to them. And it occurred to me, and I think it annoyed them quite a lot, but that's the way it goes.
You wrote, or rather in a speech you gave at the University of Chicago, your topic was, where do ideas come from? You said the general activity of seeking to firm up or discredit the factual premises on which social and political action are based seem to be a socially worthwhile action.
Oh, that's gorgeously put.
That's right. That's why I wanted to read it to
I
you.
wouldn't dream of improving upon that.
And you went on to say that this is a job of fundamental importance because facts rarely speak for themselves. There are usually too many facts and not infrequently too many different versions of the facts. Rather than speaking for themselves, various facts have what we have come to refer to as spokespersons. So in a way, we're getting in.
What an eloquent fellow! Now,
that's right.
What year did I say that?
I forgot to look, but it was at your talk at the University of Chicago. I guess it was in the 90s.
Right around the 100th anniversary of the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, we're all older now.
Yeah, that's right. But you see, I like to go back and read this stuff so I can hold you to your word. So you've opened up a place that I want to go, which is really what a political scientist does, and
that's what we do.
Why he does. And you've just explained it.
Yeah.
In other words, bursting the myth of, for example, McCarthy.
Well, it isn't a matter of necessarily being contrarian, although some do make a good living at that, but simply attempting to put empirical foundations under what we think we know.
Mm-hmm. Now, in going back and looking at a small portion of your work, I have a sense of two intellectual tracks you're on. One we've just discussed, that is bursting the balloons or the false premises by looking at the facts. But you go on to call yourself a quasi-anthropologist. And explain to us what you mean by that. And it seems that it involves a different attitude toward your subjects.
Well, my method of working, there are a very large array of possible ways of going about social science. My particular way of doing it is to talk to people, listen to people, watch people, and then write down what I've learned. Mm-hmm. It's quasi-anthropological in the sense that I am not, in fact, an anthropologist, but I do have a good deal of regard for the actual people who are doing the acting, and I attempt to find out as best I can what their perspective is on things, because then it helps you quite frequently to understand what they're going to do next. Mm-hmm. So that's now, but that's I don't think that's different from whatever it is you thought my other track was. Mm-hmm. The idea is to find out what's going on, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. and attempt to talk about it in some way that is easily storable and compact and understandable and communicable to other people.
One of the many subjects that you've covered is the Congress, and we're going to talk about your new work in a minute, but I would like to go into the origins. It's quite fascinating how you wound up getting interested in Congress, and it was really about a course that you were asked to teach, right?
Well, when I was a teenager, and my family moved to Washington, I used to get out and hang around Congress. In those days, no guards, no nothing, and you could just hang out and see what they were doing, which I thought was quite a lot of fun. And sometimes I'd talk to people, but mostly I'd just watch. Anyway, I, however, did not write about a Washington-centric topic for my doctoral dissertation, and my first teaching job was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It was a temporary job created because two people senior to me, a good deal senior to me, went on leave. And one of whom was I suppose, greatest congressional scholar of his generation, Ralph Hewitt. Anyway, they thought when they hired me that I would teach the other guy's course, Harry Scoble's course on community power. But nobody much took the community power course, and they figured people were taking Ralph's course on Congress. And so the chairman of my department, Leon Epstein, who still remains a dear friend, this is a long time ago now, this is 1960 mm-hmm. or 61. Leon calls me in and he says, well, why don't you teach Ralph Hewitt's course on Congress? I said, I've never taken a course on Congress. I do know something about the Senate because I was a snooper when I was a teenage political junkie. But I don't know anything about the House of Representatives, really. Very little, anyhow. Oh, he says, you'll make out all right. You're a smart fellow. So I taught this course and scrounged around and found a few things, and brought in the member of Congress from Madison, who's only a few years ago, still lives in Washington, Bob Kastenmeier, nice fellow. And at the end of the course, I said, well, that was sort of interesting. Maybe I ought to pursue my method, which is go to Washington and hang around the House of Representatives a while and see what I can make out of that, because there is practically no literature on the subject. Literature, as you know, is a word that scholars use. It means it's written stuff which other scholars write and which scholars regard as respectable and more or less codifying what we know. That's the literature. Mm-hmm. There wasn't much. Mm-hmm. So the summer after I taught at Madison, we moved to Washington, and I started, a member of Congress had agreed to let me hang around with him for a week, sit in his office, and every once in a while I'd interview him a little bit, but mostly just see what the flow was like, what his calendar was like, what came up, who talked to him, and what he said to them. This was a lovely gent by the name of Charles Mosher from, I believe it was the 13th District of Ohio, Oberlin. And I spent a week with him, and then I went with Kastenmeier, who said I could follow him around, and then I was moving at that point from Wisconsin to Wesleyan. So I asked the two Wesleyan alumni who were in Congress if I could do the same thing with them. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat, Abner Seibel, Mim D'Addario. Did the same thing with them. Started, mooching around, interviewing. That, in other words, learning the territory. Mm-hmm. And that's how I got interested in Congress. I did a lot of work on Congress.
So would it be fair to say that somebody who wants to do this political science, in a way, has to embed himself in the environment and, at one level, be respectful of what is going on and to understand the complexity?
No. If you want to do it my way, that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
But there are, in fact, lots of different ways of doing it.
Okay.
Lots of different ways, and that just happens to be responsive to the way I assimilate information and learn about things.
Mm-hmm. Now, to prepare to be a political science, what skills do students have to acquire, and what traits should they come with?
I think they have to be interested in politics. That's the main thing.
Yeah. And what makes politics interesting?
Well, I don't know. People win, people lose. It's important. A lot of the outcomes in politics are important to human existence, various ways. Sometimes, of course, you have to know a bit in order to be able to work the system or get the system to do what you want. I mean, there are lots of different reasons why it might be fun to know about politics. And if you get really interested in politics, then the next step, it seems to me, is to assess how you learn best.
You mean personally?
Yeah, what sort of person you are.
Yeah.
And I suppose, because it's a very expensive way to do, unfortunately,
that is going and hanging out.
Going and hanging out, which is a very expensive thing. It's time-consuming. I mean, other people, for example, who have a taste for numbers, can get what they need by reading tables and by looking up statistics and making arguments based on that. So, I mean, other people are bookworms and like to read great books and dope out what great people have said about great topics.
So it's interesting. You really are suggesting that it's A, being interested in the sets of problems, but then B, respect for your own integrity about what you like to do and what you do well, in terms of defining the style by which you approach the subject.
Integrity is a kind of an edgy word.
Okay,
that
all right, give me a better word.
That there's something assaulting your integrity.
That's right.
No, just try and figure out what you're good at.
Yeah.
And my belief is that there are multiple forms of intelligence, and different people are good at different things, and what they ought to be doing is finding out what they're good at and doing that and having fun at it too.
Now, in addition to hanging out, which you said you do, and in addition to being a voracious reader, going and finding polls that had been taken by others and so on, I get the sense that it's important to be a part of a community of scholars. When one looks at your book, which we will talk about, your forthcoming, which we will talk about in a minute, there's a sense in which you've felt a responsibility to navigate what has been written, and identify the better works, but also respond to the others.
Well, you've opened up a number of topics. Scholarly communities. These are communities which, in effect, certify knowledge as knowledge, tell you what the problems are, tell you what we already know, and they're an audience. If you haven't got an audience of scholars, frequently, for example, journalists don't have scholarly audience on the whole. They broadcast to the millions, but their work therefore has a short life. If you in effect take seriously what a scholarly community can do for you, then you can sort of in effect hook on to the problems that seem to exist in the environment and contribute. That's what it means to make a contribution, is to get your work accepted by such a community. But it's not compulsory that you do so. You can write for popular audiences, but the trouble is what you find out isn't conserved as efficiently as when you write for a scholarly community.
So there's an element of immortality in, that it will, that your work will transcend the present. Is that?
Well, if you mean between now and next week.
Okay. But maybe 2 weeks for academics,
well,
one week for journalists.
Sure, that's the point. I give as an example, as it happens, they're a wonderful example. By many accounts, the best work of journalism written in the immediate post-war period about United States politics was a book by John Gunther, a very fine journalist, called Inside USA, which got a rave front-page review on the New York Times, and it generally was very highly regarded book. And still is today, but it's not cited anywhere. And it's not referred to anywhere. Yeah. And it is roughly contemporaneous with a book of roughly the same size and heft by V.O. Key Jr. called Southern Politics and State and Nation, which is still in print.
I see.
And cited everywhere. And now, what was the difference? Gunther wrote as a journalist for national circulation and got it, and succeeded and did a fine job. And V.O. wrote for a more scholarly audience, more restricted, but a structured community, which so valued his work that they have kept it alive for whatever it's been now, since 1949.
Before we talk about the book on the house, which we'll do in a minute, you've assumed two very important roles one as director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, where you really had to deal with the leadership of putting together intellectual communities on issues of domestic politics and so on. Tell us a little about that. In other words, what is different from the theoretical notion of academic community versus the leadership role in forging community?
Well, in the first place, it isn't being the quarterback, it's being the blocking back.
Mm-hmm. Meaning?
Well, meaning if you're lucky enough to be part of a very resourceful, interesting intellectual community, mm-hmm. that is to say, a lot of smart people around, mm-hmm. What you do is simply find out who wants to do what.
I see.
And help them.
Mm-hmm. So who are you blocking then?
Well, blocking for.
Oh, I see. Blocking for. Got you, okay.
Blocking for. That's the
see,
idea.
yeah.
Is you make a way for people who are carrying the ball.
Yeah.
And that was what I did and what I like to do.
Yeah.
And it's really quite a lot of fun to see people succeed because you've helped them out.
Yeah.
So, for example, I mean, I give you a rather large handful of examples. A dreadful fire devastated a part of our town. One of our senior colleagues...
Berkeley, you're talking about.
Berkeley.
Yeah.
Yes. One of our senior colleagues was about halfway through his magnum opus, and it was destroyed in the fire.
Gee.
Okay. 2 days later, or a week later, I called him up and I said, and I will not use his name, but I did use that. I said, I have a rather substantial sum of money, which I named, for you, for your purposes in going after that book again. Mm-hmm. And I want it firmly on record that you did not ask for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very nice.
Okay.
And so he was able to finish his work.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And it's a brilliant, wonderful piece of work.
Yeah.
And obviously he needed more help than that, but okay. Now, I was in a position to do that. That, in my opinion, is leadership. Here's another example. We established a bunch of seminars. I discovered just by chance, very odd way. I was visiting at Harvard, and the man who is currently the executive editor of the New York Times was just being sent to London to be a foreign correspondent. Never been in London before. A pal of mine sent him up to me at Harvard and said, brief him. Mm-hmm. So I convened a dinner of a bunch of Harvards who were various ex-Rhodes scholars, mm-hmm. expats, mm-hmm. One thing and another. They had a glorious time. They'd never actually met in the same room. Yeah. And I thought when I got back to Berkeley, I said, well, hell, we can do this here. Mm-hmm. So we established the UK seminar, which has been going on, howling success, because people love to talk about this kind of thing. Third example, on a daily basis, this is a big, ugly, as you know, impersonal university. Mm-hmm. You do something, and visiting scholars tend to get lost. Mm-hmm. Well, as you know,
yes, that's right.
We do at IGS in my time, and since we do tea at 3 o'clock every afternoon. Yeah. Right. And you know it because you've come down yourself and
thought it was such a great idea that I wanted to do it.
That's what you wanted to do, but you didn't do it. I didn't.
Yeah.
And you, in fact, used to take our teacups up to your office.
Right. That's part of my criminal past.
That's right. That's right. So, all right, now that's leadership, i.e. making things possible, facilitating.
Yeah, and there's another element in one of your works where you worked on innovation. You made the argument that innovation often came from experts, but also it was part of an intellectual process of comparing. And so you brought a European dimension to that effort.
We've always had visiting scholars in my time from Europe, from Asia, from around the country. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Now, this other leadership role that you held was as editor of the APSR, and that is a major responsibility of really defining are helping to shape the discourse in the field.
Yeah,
So
I claim not.
Okay, you claim that.
No,
You deny
that's right.
that, yeah.
That's right. My job was to receive proffered articles
I see.
and to give them an honest reading, that
I
is to
see.
say, get other people to read them
I see. And come to the conclusion about them.
and come to a conclusion about them, and then print.
I see.
Except the ones that were acceptable to the people referees we sent them to.
Yeah. Now, as part of that task, I know that you used to run a seminar at your home.
That's right.
I was a member.
You remember
yeah.
the seminar.
So we're telling all these trade secrets, but really the idea here was to help facilitate the training of a future generation.
Sure.
Is that, yeah.
Sure, but look, this was easy. The American Political Science Review gave me some resources to basically receive, evaluate, and publish articles from the profession of political science at large. It was based here. So I interpreted that as a kind of an educational opportunity. There are graduate students around. They're reading this journal. They're going to have to publish in this journal. Why not get a bunch of graduate students to come in? I guess we had a monthly meeting, and each graduate student would take responsibility for a single article and go check the footnotes.
Yeah. But also meet with the authors.
Yeah, and sometimes we have authors or people, speakers, people coming through, and the idea would be to give them some feel for the profession they were entering, and that seemed easy to do, and so we did it.
Okay, so let's talk a little about Congress. So you really, your new book is really the culmination of a, shall we call it, a 40-year affair with the Congress, or what?
It's been 40 years since I've studied Congress, and have kept up with it as best I could. Now, here's an example. Political scientists get their agenda, obviously, from the community in which we work, but also from life, from current events, from politics. The most important thing, probably, that happened to the House of Representatives over the last 50 years, say, was that it went from a body dominated by the conservative coalition of Democrats, conservative Democrats, Dixiecrats mostly, and Republicans, and to a condition in which they were dominated by the majority of the majority party, which was Liberal Democrats. In other words, it liberalized. This is obviously before the big change in the mid-90s when the Republicans took over. But over the sweep of time, it was the conservative coalition giving way to a programmatic liberal majority of the majority party. All right, and the question is, why did it happen? That was, say, it's a political science question. Why did it happen? Although, in principle, it could also be a current events question. Why did it happen? But in any event, I took that as the theme for this book that I've just written. And my conclusion was, as you know, air conditioning.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, let me.
A simple way
right.
to make a complex point.
All right. Let me give you the 40-second version. It went this way. In order for the House to liberalize, it was necessary for the majority of the majority party to find its voice. The majority of the majority party could not find its voice when the Democratic caucus, Democrats were in the majority, the Democratic caucus basically was moribund, could not meet and could not act because it had so many Dixiecrats in it.
Essentially conservative Democrats from the South.
From the South.
Right.
All right. Now, what happened? Well, the Dixiecrats disappeared. Why did they disappear? So then you move backward. They disappeared because of the rise of the Republican Party in the South. Sooner or later, conservatives, instead of being Dixiecrats, became Republicans. Now, why did they become Republicans? Well, because a sufficient number of people moved to the South from the North who were Republicans. And the question is, why did they move south? That didn't happen. After all, this Dixiecrat phenomenon is 100 years old.
That is the phenomenon that put the Dixiecrats in their positions of power.
Yeah, it was 100 years old, from the Civil War and the Reconstruction onward. So why did that finally break down? Why did Republicans suddenly appear down there? And the answer is they migrated down there. And why did they migrate down there? Well, basically because the South, a fair number of them had spent winters down there, but with the introduction in the early 1950s of residential air conditioning, people began to stay down there. And it was interesting to me, the first safe Republican seat in the South, outside the ones up in the Appalachian Mountains, there were only 4 or 5 of those, but the first safe Republican seat under the new dispensation was St. Petersburg, Florida, which was a winter resort, and it happened in 1954, and then Dallas, Texas, and then
that was Bruce Alger's seat.
Bruce Alger. That's right. You're a Texan, so
that's right.
You remember these.
And I was pleased to read that Northerners were wimps and had to have air conditioning before they could move down.
Well, that's right.
That's right.
As Southerners were miserable.
That's
right.
But
anyway, that seemed to be. And now, how did I verify this? Well, there's some demographic material which seems to show this, and also, of course, I went around and talked to some Southern Republican congressmen, and they told me some wonderful stories about how they had become Republican or their parents had become Republican, and it was all about Northerners moving down and making it possible.
And an example here would be Trent Lott, who originally was a Dixiecrat, right?
Trent Lott was originally a Democrat. He worked for a congressman from Pascagoula, Bill Calmer. When Bill Calmer retired in 1972, Trent Lott went home, switched parties, ran for his seat, and won. So that was sure. But you're really saying it's not just you're in a way being humorous. I mean, obviously air conditioning is key, but you're really talking about the modernization of the South, the movement of people to the cities, and that whole complex of technological change and so on. That's right. Well, all right, if you want to, you begin with the tractor.
Yeah.
You begin with pesticides.
Right.
You begin, with machinery for picking cotton, driving people off
and not just technology, but also changes the Voting Rights Bill and so on.
The Voting Rights Bill basically strengthened the liberal wing of the Democratic Party and encouraged conservative Democrats to move to the Republicans.
Now, it's interesting because taking this long-term perspective as you analyze reform, in a way you're offering an answer to people of my generation in the 60s who argued for change, but you couldn't get it right away because you couldn't get the legislation through the Congress so long as the Dixiecrats were in place. So what you're suggesting is there is a long-term change and an evolution that allows the liberal agenda to be implemented.
Well, it happened that way.
Yeah. So hence the need to explain this process over time.
Well, yeah. I do think it's important because you're speaking now from the standpoint of somebody who wants to manipulate the system or to succeed in the system, and that, in my opinion, requires knowledge. And this was my attempt to convince people that this is what you needed to know in order to get what you wanted.
Let's talk a little more about the Congress. I mean, who are examples of people you see in the Congress who you've known or written about or studied who emerge as really formidable leaders in the system?
Well, you've already learned that I have a very individual view of what leadership is.
Right. But well, tell us what that is.
All right. Now, for a legislative body, leaders are not necessarily the people who have the best press releases and who make the most ringing speeches. For a legislative body like Congress, we have a lot of power. My view is that the most significant leaders of Congress are generally those people who are trusted by their colleagues to frame issues for them. The most, I suppose, conspicuous example, I've known a number of people who are that way. Tom Foley was very much that way when he was there, and my good friend Carl Elliott, who was a congressman from Alabama and was deeply trusted by his colleagues, including by people who didn't agree with him about things. He was, of course, a liberal. And although he didn't show it on civil rights, couldn't show it on civil rights given the situation in Alabama, nevertheless, when Carl Elliott told people something, they were able to put it in the bank and they were able to act on it. And so my view is the people who are certainly most interesting to me are the people who operate within the group structure in such a way as to give a orientation and information to their colleagues, which leads them to decide the way they do.
But are these people, in addition, visionaries in the sense that they point to a future route that may not be possible at this point in time?
Well, I think some are and some aren't. But I'm not terribly impressed by people who take that kind of view about taking the sort of the long future. Bob Dole used to say his vision was, let's survive till lunch. and of course, the newspaper people demanded that he have a vision thing.
Yeah, I see.
And it wasn't him. But some of these people, well, certainly were quite idealistic. Carl Elliott, deeply convinced of the need for education, all up and down the system, vocational education, language education, higher education, all kinds of education. I mean, in that sense, I suppose he was a visionary, but I only use it because it's a compliment to him.
Yeah, right. So you would see it more as doing the job well.
But the question is, what is the job? And the job is seeing the relationship between what you're doing today and what can happen tomorrow.
And what skills are involved in being able to do that successfully?
Patience, goodwill. It really helps to be a decent person in a legislative body, because people remember when you're not. But you know, it takes all kinds. A place like the House of Representatives, 435 people, all kinds of people there, and all kinds of people doing constructive work. And I must say, some of the nicest people there were not doing constructive work at all because they didn't believe in it. So it's a very complicated story.
How important are principles for these actors? That is, principles to a broader set of values?
It doesn't hurt.
Doesn't hurt. But it doesn't necessarily lead to success or failure then, basically.
Well, success is when you've got enough votes. So, I mean, in a legislative body.
Yeah, yeah.
Mind you.
Yeah. We're in an era now after 9/11 where foreign policy is going to again be very important and very much on Congress's agenda. How well has Congress done this kind of work? Is it so different from what they normally do that it's harder, or can they adapt to these new kinds of challenges?
They certainly can adapt. Congress is, the House of Representatives now, Senate has, of course, confirmation powers, treaty power, that kind of thing. But the House of Representatives has mostly the power of the purse, appropriations powers. And so it's in the details. They can also do some other things, which include running timely investigations. So there are some things that they can do, but it isn't easy for Congress as a collectivity to have as big an impact on foreign policy as they have on other forms of public policy.
Do you have any thoughts about how 9/11 and the response will affect the Congress and other institutions of American government?
No, not really. Over the short run, it helped the presidency a lot. As is always the case when we have a crisis associated with foreign affairs, we have what is called in our business the rally round the flag, and we got one. And that helps the president. And whether he can do much with it other than attempt to, for example, the creation of a Homeland Security operation strikes me as completely misguided. But they're going to get it because it would be vaguely unpatriotic to oppose it on the grounds that it would be ineffective. So, in a sense, somewhere in one of my voluminous works, I define what a crisis is in public affairs. A crisis is a period where everybody believes that something must be done. That's a crisis. And we, obviously, 9/11 produced one. But it's much harder to claim. It's certainly not a war in the sense that World War II was a war.
Right.
They're claiming it's a war, but there's no particular nation state. We're maybe creating one out of Iraq at this point, but hard to see how this will all play out. But a war against terrorism, rather like the war against cancer, and that is, there's no doubt about it that it's something we'd like to eradicate, but it's terribly difficult to figure out how to do it.
So it would be different than the crises that you discuss in your book, where, for example, the Depression, World War II, the response to the Kennedy assassination, where there was a more focused agenda about what the Congress could do in terms of legislation.
Well, they did a whole bunch of things. Some of them related to the crisis, and some of them not.
Yeah.
It was a mixed bag.
Yeah. But in this case, we're dealing in a world of amorphous adversaries, and one gets the sense in the Homeland Security that it's sort of changing the signs on the doors and calling that a reorganization.
Well, if those were the only transaction costs, that would be swell. But I have a feeling those are not the only transaction costs.
There are two things that I want to talk about related to your work as we near the conclusion of the interview. One is writing. You write extremely well and very lucidly, with great clarity and simplicity. Did you learn that?
Yes, I learned it.
You learned, but did it come naturally? Or
yes. I used to read a fair bit. And I admired, there are some writers I admire quite a lot because they write clearly. And I found myself imitating E.B. White, Mark Twain, people like that.
Right.
And so I suppose I write imitatively. The rule about clarity is perfectly straightforward. If I write a sentence and then I say to myself, what did I mean by that? It means it wasn't clear, and I have to do something about it. My goal is to be able to understand the next day what it was I meant.
That's right, the day before.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And is that hard work, or does it come easier with time?
It depends entirely. Sometimes it's hard work, sometimes it's easy. It just varies. Sometimes I get bitten my teeth and away I go, and other times it's just like breaking rocks. It just depends.
Another issue that I wanted to raise, not an issue, but to get a sense of you and your work is, it is rumored that you have a sense of humor. And I wanted you to talk a little about rumor. I'm being facetious, Nelson. What role does humor play in discourse?
Somebody with a sense of humor normally doesn't explain when they're being facetious.
I see. But could you tell us about that strength and the role it plays in discourse?
It's not a strength. As a matter of fact, it's risky.
It's risky.
Yeah. Frequently, I've said things that were meant to be silly and were taken quite seriously. And I knew they were silly, but other people just thought they showed that I was an unsound person. So
it's not something that you would recommend to others?
Well, certainly not to someone who runs for public office.
I see.
But I can get away with it because I've got tenure. But
I see. Okay. So let's conclude now, and let me ask you: if you were advising students, if students were to sit through this interview, any recommendations for how they should prepare for the future if they want to pursue political science?
Well, the main thing is to enjoy it. Find their own voice. Most important thing in the world is to have a mind of your own. And I have to say, in graduate education around here, and to a certain extent also even in undergraduate education around here,
Berkeley,
we attempt to help people find their voice and find what they're good at, and there are obviously skills associated with it, and we're certainly as prepared as many universities are to bring them up to speed with respect to those skills. But the main thing is to find a mind of their own and pursue what interests them.
Now, in watching this videotape of this interview with you, is there a lesson that emerges from this story of a man who sort of committed himself to political science, broad interests, and kind of an effort to help us understand how our institutions work?
No.
No lesson?
No lesson.
Okay. Well, on that note, I hope that the students will find some reason to watch the tape. So, Nelson, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.